Hey there, welcome to today's episode. It's going to be another live unedited session. A little bit of a noisy day here in London, so apologies for any background noise, but we are back with the Ableton Move, and this time I want to deep dive into looking at the sampling and sample chopping. The initial episode was just getting started, some of the basic features and functions, but moving forward with the channel and this particular device, I'd like to deep dive into certain aspects of it, and today it is going to be sampling. I'm assuming you know how to get started, you know we're looking at the sets. In the first episode, I showed you though that you can create a blank template if you like. If you don't want it to boot up 4 random instruments, we can create a basic template where we've got more of a blank canvas, and that's what I'm going to be using here. So because it's a template and this device auto saves, if I make any tweaks or changes to my template, I've kind of ruined it. So I always start by making a copy of the template using the copy button, pasting it up here. Then we're going to select our copy of our template and press any track to load it up. You will see my template consists of a drum kit. All of these are empty. There'll be no sounds on the device currently, or nothing loaded in. And you can see we've got the drum kit. We have a choke kit. Then I've got 2 of these 32 pad samplers, again, with nothing loaded. That's how I want to start. I want to bring in my own samples, play around. That's how I'm going to begin. If you want to follow along and do the same thing, it's just the same as loading any instrument type in, but Ableton have given us some blank instruments to get us started. You just select the track, make sure that everything is highlighted so you're on like a kit instrument level. Then we can press the encoder and you'll see I've got a drum kit, a choke kit, a gate kit, a blank sampler, and we've got a couple of other initialized presets for the synth engines, which I'm not going to go into today, but that's where you find those. You can go back a level. I just want to show you how you access that. They're in a folder called templates. It's underneath pretty much everything else that you see. Right at the bottom, there's a folder called templates. Go in there, select the ones you want. In this case, I'll keep it as a drum kit, but that's how you load them up. When we move to the choke kit, the reason that's different, pretty self-explanatory, but every single pad has been set to the same choke group. It's a really good way of setting things up, because if you have to do that manually and you have to set the choke group for every pad, it can be a bit long-winded, so having one set up as your template is really good, and Ableton have given us that just to get us going. So we've got our choke groups. Let's talk about those very quickly. You can only have one choke group per 16 pads on this device. Your SP404 Mark II, your MPC, you'll be able to allocate multiple different choke groups and even apply those within the same 16 pads. This is much more limited. Just wanted to point that out. It doesn't bother me particularly. It may bother you. Let's go to the drum kit, because this doesn't have any choke group enabled, but we can actually do that. There's a reason for that, of course. Maybe you're putting a little kit together, and there is a reason. You don't want a couple of samples overlapping. That's really what choke groups are for. Other ways you can use them. And I'm making some assumptions that because you're watching a video about sampling, you understand choke groups and mute groups as they're called on other devices. But if we wanted to just set a couple of samples within this, we can do it. We do it by accessing a menu that I didn't show you yesterday because I didn't know it existed until last night when I was digging further into the device. So let's see that. For every pad, I showed you every one of these 8 encoders has a different parameter per pad. So we've got transpose, start, attack, hold, decay, playback effect, and then the final 2 encoders depend on the playback effect. So in this case, it's stretch. So these 2 change the stretch factor and the grain size. If I swap that to looping, these will change to looping parameters. Keep that in mind. 8 of these. You can actually access another 8, and we do that by moving from pad sample. We want to click over to the right, so we're back on a kit level. And if I just put my finger on the encoder, you notice it highlights everything. I'm not clicking on the encoder, I'm just keeping it there. If I press shift though, and then I do the same thing, we now see parameter banks, and I can click the encoder, and I've got my main bank highlighted on the left-hand side. That is everything I've just shown you, all of these parameters. And if you're ahead of me, you move over to the right, we've now got filter and setup, where we have 8 new parameters. So we've got filter frequency, filter resonance, filter type, envelope mode, trigger and gate that is. We've got choke, we've got velocity, velocity filter, and also panning, which a few people have mentioned in the comments. So that's how you access those. The only difference that you have is that when you load something like this, a drum kit, you will get essentially 8 and 8, so 16 parameters. If you load up a synth, you get your initial main bank of 8 parameters, but when you switch over to the next set, filter and setup, According to the manual, you only get another 2 parameters that you can choose. So you get 10 for the synths and 16 for things like the drum rack. So pretty cool. The next thing I want to show you is how we can begin to start sampling. So if we want to actually, one thing before I go ahead of myself, we need to apply our choke groups. That's why we're here. So with filter and setup, I want to show you how to apply choke group to a couple of pads. As you saw before, as I scrolled through, pad number 5 is the one where we have our choke groups. Very simple. It's a case of turning the choke off and on. Only 1 choke group per set of 16 pads. So there's no fancy settings. There's no other choke groups to choose. Only the 1 choke group on or off for the pads. I'm going to leave it off. Now we can move and I can show you the other thing I want to show you. Let's move down to the bottom. This is one of my 32 pad samplers. It's one of the blank presets. Has no samples included in it. So nothing's loaded, nothing's been sampled. This is chromatic mode. And the other mode that you've got still is shift and this little musical note icon. You will see we can open our menu and switch to in key. Now, there's a reason you might want to do that. We're going to sample something in here. If you know the note that you're sampling in, let's say it was a C note from an old vintage synth or something, that's a great way of taking an old vintage synth, find the middle C note, sample it in, and then you can play it like an instrument on this device. The cool thing is though, if you choose the correct root note for the note that you are sampling in, when you play around with in key and you do your chords and you change key and scale, it's going to be correct. I hope that makes sense. You might have to try it out for yourself, but that's what it allows you to do. Now we're just going to sample something daft, so it doesn't matter to me that we are in key mode. I'm actually going to switch it back to chromatic, just like this. I'm going to sample to this little root note here, but I can sample to any other pad at any given time. And you can actually do that even if you've got a synth loaded up. You can have a synth loaded up and you can be playing your synth on all these notes. I can still just choose one of the pads and record to it. It's pretty crazy, but you can do that. You can just, record freely whenever you like. We're going to begin to record. We do that by accessing the menu with the sampling menu, which is this button here, and then we can set up our options for recording. When we want to begin to record, we just press the pad. When we want to stop recording, we press the pad again, or we press the record button. Let's take a look at our options. You'll notice there's a couple of things I want to show you. We're actually going to start with the microphone. So on this device, we can record from our microphone input, we can record from our line input, and we can record from the main output, so you can resample on the device. In the first episode, I showed you that. It's a great way of freeing up tracks. You can build an entire synth track here, and if you want to free up space and get this track back, you can resample your synth loop and put it into something like a drum rack where it will play that loop, and you can free up a new track. Keep that in mind. I want to show you something though. This is line in because we have a line in cable. It's currently coming from my iPad. If I click, I can change the source. So I can go to resampling, or I can go back to my line in. Now, the reason I want to show you that is because you would think I could choose the microphone as well. You can't if you have a line in cable plugged in. Let's just take this out. I'm not going to take it all the way out, but that now switches to the microphone. Just want you to know there's that slight limitation there, or something you have to work around. I don't know why you can't have all 3 sources at the same time, but you can't. So now I can choose between mic, or I can choose resampling. We're going to start with the microphone because that's what we want to do. Showed you resampling before, so we're mainly going to look at the microphone and the line input. I want to record something daft here. Just going to do a finger click. As I mentioned, we just press the pad, do a finger click, and then we'll stop it. So let's do that. Press the pad to stop, or press the record button. That is now loaded up. It's pretty cool, and the microphone on this I think has got quite a good quality. One thing that I want you to notice though, if you've got a keen eye and a keen ear, when I press the pad to record, there is a microsecond there where I have to think about that, and then I click my fingers. So we had some dead space, but you'll notice it's moved it to the first transient, and that is good to go. It's got no dead space. We know it's got dead space because if we press our second encoder, we can see the dead space on the waveform view before it. If I press this shift button, I can zoom in as well and take a closer look. But yeah, it's moved the start point over for us, so we don't have to trim that off. I haven't found any truncating mode on this device, so I don't know how you would trim any sample start off if you don't want that. But of course, you can move your start point over, and this does it automatically. So we've recorded a simple finger click. It's pretty cool. We can move over and use the effects. You've got 2 effects per track. You can set the effects to whatever you want. There's a range of effects, but we'll just use whatever's here. We've got delay. Gonna dial in a little delay. And let's put in a little reverb. Getting some pretty weird sound designs, pretty cool. One thing that I want to mention again though is that we have a shift button. The shift button locks, I showed you that in the first episode. That is useful for when you're looking at things like your start points. We need to go back to the pad first. We can take a look at this. When I press the shift button, it zooms in. But of course, when I let go, it disappears. If you double click, you can shift lock. And then when I do this, I can hold that page open a little bit longer. It's going to be more useful to you. Still comes back eventually, but it holds it longer. The other function of the shift button, if we move back to our delay or something like that, is that it gives you fine increments for everything that you're doing. So you want to get to a point value in terms of your BPM or something like this, just as we're dialing this in. Now when I'm moving this encoder, it's really slow so we can fine tune this in. If you really need to dial something in, you find the encoder's moving too fast, just turn your shift button on. You can lock it like we can do as well here, but we're going to unlock it now, move forward. So once we've loaded this in, of course, we've added the effects. You've got the octaves, which are cool because this is a 32 pad layout, so I can come down the octaves a couple of them. We could go right up. Sounds almost like rain, but you're going to get into some pretty cool sound design pretty quick there. Let's just leave it like that for now. Let's move on to the next type of sampling, which is from the line input, and we can begin to look at sample chopping, but that's your basic sampling mode using the microphone. We're going to move to our second track, which is the choke kit, because we've got a choke group, as we've already spoke about. That's going to be useful for what we want to do. I'm going to press the sampling button. Just watch again as I plug this back in. You'll notice now when I'm choosing, I've got resampling or my line in because it's detected that we've got a line input. My iPad is set up. I'm going to be using one of my own compositions, just a loop that I made. The reason for that being that I don't want to get stung by YouTube's algorithm. So we just need something that we can play and we can chop up. Of course, you can just sample to one pad. You're just recording something short, a kick drum or something. But in this case, we want to create multiple sample chops. This device doesn't sample chop like other devices. It's more of an old school manual way of putting things in, but it's still quite clever, and I'll show you that as we go through. If you're looking for an auto detect where it looks for the transients and things, we don't have that. I wouldn't mind seeing that as a firmware update. I don't think it needs loads of modes because we've only got a small screen, so I don't think it would benefit from a lot of different auto chopping modes, but maybe one where it just looks for the transients. Maybe you can adjust the threshold. I think of that as a firmware update would be kind of cool. You can let me know what you think in the comments. But I've got no problem sample chopping in this way. In fact, I quite like it. Kind of a big fan of manually chopping. When we want to chop to multiple pads, that's all we have to do. We start with our first pad, it will begin to record, and wherever we want to put a slice point in, we will trigger that by hitting the next pad. It's pretty seamless. If we need to adjust anything in terms of our input gain, we can still do that now for the line in. I'm just going to play my sample to make sure that we can hear it and make sure it sounds okay. Sounds good to me. One thing that was in the first video, someone said they thought the sound quality of this device was bad. It's actually really, really good, and a lot of people agreed with me there. I think part of what it was that I used some drums, but I took them from a drum kit. It's from the Beat Butcher, so they're pretty lo-fi. It's going to be the same when I'm playing a sample like this. I made this as like a fake vinyl sample, so if you think it sounds a bit gritty and a bit kind of lo-fi, that's because I deliberately designed it that way. Don't be thinking that it's got some weird, crappy sound quality, because yeah, this device sounds excellent. Anyway, in order to begin, I'm going to have to probably have a little bit of dead space because by the time I reach to my iPad, it'll put a little bit dead space in. I'm going to just start with the basic sample chopping. So I'm just listening, knowing where the kind of rhythm is of the sample, and I'm going to pop those chops in. But of course, you can be flexible and do whatever you like with it. But that's how we're going to start. So let's do that. Again, I'll hit the pad or the record button to stop. So we've made 8 basic chops. Of course, I could have done 16. I only want 8 for this example so that we've got something to work with. Now, the first one, we know we've got a bit of dead space here. We play that. That's my chop, but there's a bunch of dead space, so let's fix that first. We use the second encoder, and we move into the waveform a little bit. I'm going to press the shift just to zoom in, and I'm going to dial that in right to the beginning. So we've got a start point. The one thing this doesn't have is a dedicated endpoint. However, there is a workaround for that as well. So let's use this first chop. Let's say we wanted something really short out of this with no endpoint. How do you do that? Well, actually, you can do that using hold, because that is the length of the playback. It's, adjusting that as we move it. So let's say we just wanted the very first little melodic note. Yeah, before it kind of changes there, I can use my hold to dial that in. You see, essentially that is like an endpoint. So as much as it's not advertised as an endpoint, it's hold, you can tweak things that way as well. The other thing that will kind of be highlighted now, let's just leave that one really short. But one thing I want you to pay attention to, one, we've got a choke group here. You'll notice that because as I'm playing, chokes the other pad out. Obviously, when we get to the 9th pad, I didn't record anything, so that just stops all of the playback. But take a look at the waveform view. It doesn't change. And that really confused me at first, because when I create a sample chop on most samplers, what I'm expecting to see is that small portion of audio, that small wave bar, my chop essentially right there. But what is clever about this, at first I thought it was like a little bit of a bug, but it's not. What it is doing is non-destructive chopping, and I can explain that hopefully as we go through if you're not familiar with that. But let's say where we've put our first chop in, we've got that right. The chopping, as you can see on this device, is manual, so you're putting your slices in where you want those chops. Now, if you're not very precise, and it's easy not to be, I mess it up all of the time, what I thought I would have to do is come back and retry it and do it again, which would get a little bit tedious. But actually, the reason you can see the full waveform is because that's what you're doing. You're playing a small piece of that entire waveform. So let me show you that. Let's say the second pad here, it would be a big problem if where I wanted to put my slice point in, I was a little bit late. Because if it was early, I could move the start point and shove it along to where I wanted. But if I was late and this was destructive chopping, then I wouldn't have anything to go back to. But because this is non-destructive, let's say this one was a little bit late. I think it's fine. Sounds okay to me. But when we look at the waveform, I've got the whole sample. So again, I'm going to shift lock this time so that we can keep it open. But as I move in, I can move all the way back and I can move forward. And I can do that through the entire length of that sample. It's not limited. We've got the entire thing to play for, play with even for every single pad. So actually, as limited a mode and kind of more manual as this is, it's actually very clever because it's giving us non-destructive chopping. So you can still sift through, move your start points around wherever you want them to be. I think it's actually very, very clever. So that's what we've got. We've got 8 chops. We can move our start points. You'll notice with the hold button, I can change the length of that if we want to. So you want some little small chops, you can get it. That really is sample chopping and kind of all I want to talk about. The final thing though, just very quickly, is one little thing that I'd like to see updated in the firmware. Actually, I tell a lie. There's one other thing very quickly before I get to that point. I've just remembered. We've got these pads on the right-hand side. Now, you may have seen those. You may be looking at a view, and if we press this little square icon at the bottom here, you may see this. So I've got my samples here. And nothing happens on these pads. If you turn that on, that is 16 pitches, which is pretty cool. I forgot to mention that in the first video. I'm going to mention it now. So if we turn that on, for any sample that we choose, can be anything you've got loaded into your drum rack, I can get 16 pitch variations. You get the idea. One thing that I would love to see in a firmware update is not a huge amount of additions, but I would love to see the typical 16 velocity added in here. I know you can change your velocity on the steps. There's other ways to do it, but 16 velocity is kind of a staple with us kind of sample heads, MPC heads, and it would be nice to just be able to switch between those two modes. I don't want all the others. I know there's plenty. There's filters and things you can do, but I would love to see 16 velocity as well as 16 pitch. I don't know why you would ever turn this off and just give yourself a bunch of kind of useless pads. Maybe there's some reason when you're playing or something you accidentally knock them. But for me, I generally keep them on, turned on. that was one thing I wanted to show you. The final thing, as I said, it's another limitation and something that I'd like to see improved in the firmware. And if I'm being an idiot and I've missed this in the manual and you know a way to fix this, please let me know in the comments, but I don't know currently how to sort this out. What it refers to is pitching our samples, because yeah, we can do that. We know we've got transpose plus and minus 48 semitones, so you can do a lot of pitching. But if I choose one, and we use the first one to transpose this down to whatever, -4 semitones. That's cool. You'll notice the next pad though, that hasn't been pitched down, it's still at the same pitch. That's fine because you want that creative flexibility. But when you're working and you say you've sliced up your sample, I want to pitch all of those samples at exactly the same time, and currently I can't find any way to do that. Doesn't matter, I thought maybe if you held the track button and then tweaked it, you would be able to transpose everything, maybe the shift button. I can't seem to get that to work. If you found out a way, you found something I've missed in the manual, as I said, please let me know because that's important to me. It would be great to know that information. If not, we need to kind of push forward, and I'm going to suggest some of these things to Ableton. I know you can write to their support and give suggestions. I am actually going to make that suggestion because that's really important. I don't want to have to manually change the pitch on every sample slice individually. That's going to be a big pain. But if you do know how to do it, let me know. It also doesn't work, just in case you're thinking that if you select multiple pads and try and do it that way, that doesn't seem to work either. Anyway, let me know in the comments. I hope you've enjoyed this episode. I'm going to leave it there. I think we've been through most of the things that I can think of in regards to sample chopping and just general sampling on this device. See you guys in the next episode. Take care.